The auctioneer's gavel didn't sound like justice. It sounded like a pine box nailing shut. Harlan stood on the splintered planks, a ruined man stinking of sap and stale blood, clutching a whimpering newborn to his chest. He was waiting to be sold to the highest bidder. The sun over Red Bend was a physical weight, pressing down on the muddy streets and the unwashed crowd gathered around the raised wooden platform. It smelled of horse sweat, raw whiskey, and the sharp, metallic tang of slaughterhouse runoff from down the creek. Harlan kept his head bowed, his right leg, shattered 3 weeks prior in a timber deadfall, and set poorly with nothing but a hunting knife and split pine branches, throbbed with a sickening, wet heat. He leaned his entire weight on a crutch fashioned from a stripped hickory branch. His clothes hung off him in stiff, filthy rags. He didn't care about the pain, nor the flies crawling in the matted tangles of his dark beard. His entire world was narrowed down to the bundle in his left arm. The baby felt too light. She had stopped wailing an hour ago, her cries degrading into a raspy, rhythmic clicking at the back of her throat. Dehydration. She was wrapped in a wolf pelt that smelled of smoke and old grease. Harlan shifted his grip, trying to block the brutal afternoon sun with his broad, hunched shoulder. His massive hand, scarred by frostbite and rope burns, looked absurdly brutal resting against the tiny, pale swell of the infant's forehead. Lot number 7. The auctioneer, a fat man named Higgins, with sweat stains bleeding through the armpits of his yellowed shirt, slammed his wooden mallet against the rail. Indentured labor, vagrant caught squatting on the railroad expansion line. Court orders him sold for a term of no less than 2 years to pay off county fines. A ripple of cruel laughter rolled through the crowd of ranchers, miners, and drifting hands. "Look at the leg on I am, Higgins," a voice shouted from the back, slurred and thick with drink. "He couldn't pull a stump if you hitched him to a team of oxen." "What's the reserve on the runt?" another yelled. "I got a hound that needs feeding." Harlan's chest seized. A hot, ugly spike of adrenaline hit his bloodstream, but his body had nothing left to give. He tightened his grip on the bundle. His knuckles turned white. If they tried to take her, he would use the hickory crutch to crush the first skull in range. It wouldn't save them, but it would be a reckoning. He kept his eyes on the warped floorboards between his busted boots. "Quiet down," Higgins barked, waving a hand. "He's a big brute. Got shoulders on him. He can split wood. Mend tack. The term is 2 years. Do what you want with him. Opening bid is $10. Silence. The flies buzzed. A horse stamped in the dust nearby. $5, Higgins amended, his voice losing its theatrical boom. $5 for 2 years of labor. The man's practically a gift. More silence. Men spat dark streams of tobacco juice into the dirt. A mountain man with a busted leg and a starving infant wasn't an asset. He was a liability. He was a grave, waiting to be dug. $2, Higgins said, a sneer curling his wet lips. "I'll take $2. Or by God, the sheriff drags him out back and puts him on a chain gang, and the kid goes to the orphanage in Denver." Harlan closed his eyes. The orphanage. A slow starvation instead of a fast one. He felt a profound, suffocating failure. His wife had bled out on the floor of a high-country cabin, bringing this child into the world. Harlan had dragged his broken body through 10 miles of snowmelt and mud to get them to a doctor, only to pass out at the edge of town and wake up in a debtor's cage. $2? A voice said. It wasn't a shout. It didn't boom over the crowd. It was a flat, exhausted sound, scraping through the hot air like stone on iron. The crowd parted slightly. Harlan forced his neck up, his spine popping in protest. She stood near the front, a woman in a faded gray wool dress that looked entirely too heavy for the summer heat. The fabric was stretched tight over the undeniable, heavy swell of late-stage pregnancy. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat pulled low, casting a sharp shadow over a face that was severe and entirely devoid of makeup or softness. Her skin was wind-burned, her jaw set square. She held a small leather coin purse in hands that were stained with soil and calloused at the knuckles. $2? Higgins asked, wiping his forehead with a dirty handkerchief. "Ma'am, you sure? He ain't exactly prime stock." "I have $2, she repeated. She didn't look at Higgins. She was looking dead at Harlan. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue. There was no pity in them. None at all. It was the look of someone assessing a rusted plowshare, wondering if it could turn one last field before snapping. Sold, Higgins struck the rail. To the widow, Hattie Miller. Hattie didn't wait for the sheriff to finish the paperwork. She slapped $2 onto the table, took the crumpled indentured writ, and turned her back on the murmuring crowd. "Wagons across the street," she said, her voice carrying over her shoulder. She didn't look back to see if Harlan was following. Harlan swallowed the dry grit in his throat. He shifted the baby to his right arm, jamming the hickory crutch firmly under his left pit. Every step down the 3 wooden stairs of the auction block was a masterclass in agony. Bone ground against bone in his knee. He bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted copper, forcing his good leg to take the brunt of the drop. He hobbled across the muddy thoroughfare, ignoring the stairs. The wagon was an old, listing Studebaker hitched to a single, sway-backed roan mare. Hattie was already seated on the buckboard, her hands resting heavily on the curve of her pregnant belly. She was breathing shallowly, a sheen of sweat on her upper lip. Harlan stopped at the back of the wagon. The tailgate was down, but the bed was high. A healthy man could have vaulted it. For Harlan, it was a mountain. He stood there for a long moment, the baby resting against his chest, the crutch digging into his armpit. He waited for her to sigh, to offer a hand, to scold him for his uselessness. Hattie just watched him in the rearview mirror. She didn't move. She didn't offer pity. Harlan appreciated it. He threw the crutch over the tailgate. Clamping his jaw shut, he leaned his upper body over the rough wood, protecting the baby with his torso, and hoisted his dead weight up, using just his arms and his good leg. The bad leg dragged behind him, catching on the iron hinge. Pain flared, brilliant and white-hot, behind his eyes. A low, feral grunt escaped him, but he tumbled over the edge, landing on a pile of empty burlap sacks in the bed. The wagon lurched forward immediately. Hattie didn't ask if he was settled. They rode in silence for an hour. The chaotic noise of Red Bend faded, replaced by the rhythmic squeak of the wagon's ungreased axles and the dull thud of the mare's hooves. The landscape shifted from muddy township to harsh, sprawling scrubland. Dry yellow grass rolled out toward the jagged teeth of the distant mountains, Harlan's mountains. He looked at the peaks, feeling a dull ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his leg. In the back of the wagon, the baby stirred. The reedy clicking started again, louder this time. It was a desperate sound. The wagon ground to a halt. Harlan looked up. Hattie was tying the reins to the brake lever. She turned clumsily in the seat, wincing as she favored her lower back, and tossed a canvas canteen into the bed. It hit the floorboards near Harlan's boot. "There's water," she said, her breathing heavy. "Don't pour it in her mouth, she'll choke. Tear off a piece of your shirt, soak it, and let her suck the water out." Harlan stared at the canteen, then down at his filthy shirt. He hesitated. "Dirt won't kill her today," Hattie said, reading his mind with ruthless accuracy. "Thirst will." Harlan grabbed the hem of his flannel shirt and ripped a strip free with his teeth in one hand. He uncorked the canteen, soaked the cloth, and gently pressed the wet fabric against the baby's cracked lips. Instantly, the tiny mouth latched on. The baby's hands, no bigger than walnuts, came up to weakly clutch at Harlan's thick, dirt-caked fingers. She suckled the water desperately. Harlan watched her throat work, a heavy, suffocating knot forming in his own. "She have a name?" Hattie asked. She was still turned in the seat, watching them. "No," Harlan croaked. His voice hadn't been used for anything but screaming in weeks. It sounded like tearing paper. "Ain't had time." Hattie looked at the baby, then at Harlan's mangled leg, then up at his hollow, haunted eyes. "My husband died of cholera 4 months ago," she said, her tone conversational but entirely stripped of emotion. "Left me with 60 acres of hardpan, half a roof, and this." She touched her swollen belly. "I can't chop wood. I can't lift the water buckets from the creek anymore. I need hands. You can't walk, but you have hands." Harlan looked at his hands. They were trembling. "I'm a cripple." "You're alive," Hattie countered flatly. "That's enough. I have a milk goat at the cabin. If you can keep the fire burning and the coyotes away from the pen, I'll keep your baby fed." It was a transaction. Pure, cold survival. There was no warmth in it, no grand rescue. Hattie bought him because she was drowning, and he was a piece of driftwood. Understood, Harlan whispered. Hattie turned back around and snapped the reins. They arrived as the sun was bleeding red across the horizon. The homestead was bleak. A squat log cabin sat in the middle of a cleared patch of dirt. The roof on the left side was missing its shingles, covered instead with a patchwork of rotting canvas. A rickety goat pen stood out back, and a small stack of unsplit logs lay near a chopping block. It looked exactly like what it was, a dream that had died halfway through. Hattie brought the wagon to a stop and set the brake. She climbed down, a slow, agonizing process. She gripped the wagon wheel for a moment, waiting for a cramp to pass, before walking around to the back. "Bring her in," Hattie commanded, pointing toward the cabin. Harlan went through the torturous process of exiting the wagon. By the time he stood on the dirt, leaning heavily on the hickory branch, he was drenched in cold sweat. He followed Hattie into the cabin. The inside was dim, smelling of old ash and dried sage. There was a single bed, a cast-iron stove, and a rough-hewn table. Hattie pointed to a rocking chair near the stove. "Sit." Harlan collapsed into the chair. The baby whimpered as he jarred her. Hattie didn't rest. She walked out the back door. A few minutes later, she returned, carrying a tin cup, the fresh, warm scent of goat's milk cutting through the stale air of the cabin. She stoked the embers in the stove, setting the cup near the heat to warm it slightly. When it was ready, she walked over to Harlan. She didn't hand him the cup. Instead, she reached out and took the baby from his arms. Harlan tensed, his instincts roaring at him to pull the child back. His arms felt suddenly, terribly empty, but he forced his muscles to relax. He let her take the bundle. Hattie sat on the edge of the bed. She dipped a clean piece of linen into the warm milk and brought it to the baby's mouth. The child latched instantly, taking the nourishment with frantic, tiny gulps. Hattie's face didn't soften into a motherly smile. She just watched the milk level, calculating, ensuring the baby didn't take too much too fast. Harlan sat in the rocking chair, the pain in his leg throbbing in time with his heartbeat. He watched this strange, hard woman feeding his daughter. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackle of the stove and the small, wet sounds of the infant. For the first time in a month, Harlan didn't feel like he was falling. He leaned his head back against the hard wooden slats of the chair, closed his eyes, and let the sheer exhaustion take him. He didn't know if he would survive the week, or if this woman would just work him until his heart stopped. But the baby was drinking milk. That night, Harlan slept, sitting upright in the chair, a broken man in the house of a broken woman, while the western wind howled against the canvas roof. The first frost came in late September, painting the scrubgrass silver and hardening the mud ruts into jagged ridges that threatened to snap ankles. Inside the cabin, the cold was a physical intruder, slipping through the chinks in the logs and settling deep into the marrow. Harlan learned the unforgiving rhythm of a homesteader's life through a haze of constant, throbbing agony. His leg was a ruined thing. The bone had knitted thick and wrong, leaving his right calf twisted slightly outward. He couldn't stand on it for more than a minute without a sharp, sickening spike of pain shooting up his spine. So, he adapted with a brutal stubbornness. He split the winter firewood, sitting down. He dragged a massive, flat-topped pine stump near the woodpile, hauled himself onto it, and used his immense upper body strength to swing the 10-pound splitting maul. He smelled constantly of pine resin, sour sweat, and the damp wool of his unwashed coat. His palms grew thick, yellow calluses that cracked and bled in the dry wind. He would sit out there for hours, the rhythmic times, thwack-crack, times of iron biting into wood, ringing out over the desolate plains, his breath pluming in the freezing air. Hattie didn't thank him. She merely noted the growing pile of split logs and moved on to the next task. She was a massive, lumbering shape now, her pregnancy entering its final, agonizing weeks. Her face had thinned out, her cheekbones sharp and sallow under the taut skin, while her belly stretched the faded fabric of her dresses to the breaking point. She walked with a heavy, rolling gait, her hands permanently pressed into the small of her aching back. Their existence was not a partnership born of affection. It was a desperate, silent machinery. They spoke mostly in nouns and imperatives. Water, wood, flower. Check the goat. Yet, a fragile, unspoken current began to run between them, tethered by the infant. They named the baby girl Sarah. Hattie decided it on a Tuesday, while boiling down a tough jackrabbit Harlan had managed to snare. "Can't keep calling her it or the baby," Hattie had muttered, scraping scum off the boiling water. "Sarah's a good solid name, doesn't blow away in the wind." Harlan had nodded from his rocking chair, meticulously shaving a piece of kindling. He watched Hattie with Sarah. The widow was entirely devoid of maternal softness. She didn't coo or rock the baby with gentle hums. She changed dirty linens with efficient, tight-lipped speed. She fed the child goat's milk from a rag with clinical precision. But Harlan noticed the details. He noticed that Hattie always warmed the milk cup by the stove, testing it against the inside of her own bruised wrist before letting the baby suckle. He noticed that when the wind howled fiercely enough to rattle the window panes, Hattie would quietly move the baby's makeshift crate closer to the radiant heat of the iron stove, positioning her own body as a draft shield. One evening in November, the machinery broke down. Harlan had spent the afternoon trying to patch the rotting canvas roof with pine pitch and scrap leather. The cold had stiffened his bad leg entirely. When he finally climbed down the ladder, his knee gave out. He hit the frozen dirt hard, the jar tearing a ragged, breathless scream from his throat. He lay there, his face pressed into the frost, the pain so blindingly white he thought he might vomit. He couldn't get up. He dug his thick, dirt-crusted fingers into the frozen earth, defeated. He was a cripple. He was useless. The cabin door opened. The yellow light of the oil lamp spilled out onto the dirt. Hattie stood in the doorway, a heavy woolen shawl wrapped around her massive shoulders. She looked down at him. The wind whipped her loose hair across her face. She didn't rush out. She didn't ask if he was hurt. "The wind is turning north," she said, her voice flat, cutting through the howling air. "It's going to snow. If you stay in the dirt, you'll freeze. And I can't lift the water buckets alone tomorrow." She turned and walked back inside, leaving the door wide open. It was the harshest thing anyone had ever said to him, and it was exactly what he needed. Pity would have kept him on the ground. Necessity forced him up. Snarling, Harlan grabbed his hickory crutch, dragged his dead weight upward, and hobbled into the cabin. When he shut the door behind him, he found Hattie sitting at the table. She had poured him a cup of hot chicory coffee. She didn't look up when he took it. She was busy wrapping Sarah in a clean, warmed blanket. Harlan sat heavily in his chair, wrapping his bleeding, freezing hands around the hot tin cup. He looked at the woman, feeling a strange, heavy knot of respect settle in his chest. The blizzard hit 3 days later. It didn't arrive with a warning. It slammed into the cabin like a runaway locomotive. The wind screamed through the valley, a high, demonic shrieking that rattled the log walls and threatened to tear the door off its leather hinges. The temperature plummeted so fast the frost crystallized on the inside of the window glass within an hour. Harlan was feeding the stove, his face flushed from the radiant heat, when he heard the sound. A sharp, wet splash. He turned. Hattie was standing near the wash basin. A puddle of fluid was spreading rapidly across the rough floorboards beneath her boots. She had one hand gripped tightly on the edge of the wooden table, her knuckles stark white. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat, before she let out a low, guttural moan. "Hattie?" Harlan dropped the iron poker. It clattered loudly against the stone hearth. "It's time," she gasped. Her eyes met his, and for the first time since he had seen her at the auction block, there was a flicker of pure, unadulterated fear in them. Harlan's blood turned to ice water. The cabin walls suddenly seemed to shrink. The smell of the wood smoke was replaced by a phantom scent, the metallic, cloying stench of blood. His dead wife's face flashed in his mind, pale and waxen on the floor of a high-country shack, her life draining out over the floorboards while he knelt beside her, utterly powerless. He froze. His chest seized, trapping his breath. He couldn't do this. Not again. He took a stumbling step backward, his bad leg dragging. "Harlan." Hattie's voice was a whip crack. It snapped him back to the present. She was bent over the table, riding out a contraction, her face gray with pain. "I am not her," Hattie snarled through gritted teeth, reading the terror on his face. She pushed herself up, panting heavily. "I am not dying today. Get the water boiling. Get the clean linens from the chest. Move your damn leg, mountain man." The command severed his panic. The raw, desperate necessity of the moment took over. Harlan moved. He dragged the heavy iron kettle onto the hottest part of the stove. He pulled the linens from the cedar chest. He hobbled over to Hattie, wrapping his massive, scarred arm around her waist, and half-carried, half-dragged her to the bed. The next 6 hours were a blur of blood, sweat, and screaming. The blizzard raged outside, burying the cabin in a suffocating whiteness. But inside, the air was a thick, sweltering fog of boiling water and human agony. Hattie fought like a cornered animal. She didn't weep. She cursed. She twisted the iron bed frame with her bare hands, her teeth grinding together so hard Harlan could hear the enamel squeak. Harlan rolled up his sleeves. His massive hands, built for swinging axes and breaking wild horses, were terrifyingly clumsy as he tried to help her. He wiped her brow with cool water. He checked her progress, swallowing the bile that rose in his throat at the sight of so much blood. "It's stuck," Hattie gasped, her head thrashing back against the pillow, her hair matted with sweat. "Harlan, it's not turning." "Push," Harlan demanded, his voice dropping into a ragged, commanding baritone. He gripped her knee, anchoring her. "You bought me to work, Hattie. Work with me now. Push." She screamed a raw, tearing sound that drowned out the howling wind outside. Harlan reached down. He felt the slick, impossible heat of the child. He guided the shoulders, his large hands moving with a delicate, trembling precision he didn't know he possessed. "Again!" he shouted. "One more, Hattie. Give it to me." With a final agonizing heave that lifted her entirely off the mattress, Hattie pushed. Harlan caught the slick, purple, squirming weight of the infant in his hands. He nearly dropped the child, his hands shaking violently, but he clamped his grip, quickly clearing the airway with a rough, calloused finger. A second later, a thin, furious cry pierced the heavy air of the cabin. Harlan collapsed back onto his good knee, his chest heaving, the squalling baby clutched against his chest. He looked up at Hattie. She was lying flat, her chest rising and falling in erratic, shallow jerks, her eyes closed. "It's a boy," Harlan choked out. The tears he hadn't shed for his dead wife, for his ruined leg, for his souled freedom, suddenly spilled over his soot-stained cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the grime. "You have a son, Hattie." Hattie didn't speak. She just opened her exhausted, washed-out blue eyes and held out a trembling hand. Harlan wiped the baby down quickly with a warm towel, cut the cord with a sterilized hunting knife, and placed the screaming boy onto Hattie's chest. She wrapped her arms around the infant, burying her face into his wet, dark hair. For a long time, the only sounds in the cabin were the crackle of the dying fire, the wail of the wind, and the soft, wet sniffling of the widow. Harlan pulled himself up. His body felt hollowed out, entirely spent. He dragged himself over to the wooden crate where little Sarah had slept through the entire ordeal. He picked up his daughter, holding her against his shoulder, and walked back over to the stove to throw in the last 2 logs of the night. He looked back at the bed. Hattie was watching him. The harsh, calculating edge that usually hardened her features was entirely gone, washed away by exhaustion and survival. She looked at Harlan holding his daughter, then down at the sun resting on her chest. "The auction writ," Hattie whispered, her voice raspy and weak. Harlan paused, the iron poker in his hand. "It's in the top drawer of the dresser," she continued, her eyes never leaving his. "Take it out. Put it in the stove." Harlan stared at her. He didn't ask questions. He limped over to the dresser, pulled open the drawer, and took out the crumpled piece of county paper that declared him property. He walked to the open door of the stove and tossed it inside. The dry paper caught instantly, flaring bright orange before curling into black, weightless ash. He closed the heavy iron door of the stove. He walked back to the rocking chair, pulling it closer to the bed, and sat down with Sarah in his arms. There were no grand declarations. There was no sweeping romance or sudden confessions of love. They were just a broken mountain man and a hardened widow, sitting in a snow-buried cabin at the end of the world. But as the winter howled against the canvas roof, trying and failing to get in, Harlan listened to the steady breathing of the woman and the two children, and he knew they were going to survive. They had built a fortress out of necessity. Tomorrow, he would have to chop more wood. Tomorrow, she would have to nurse two babies. The work wouldn't stop, but he wouldn't be doing it as a slave, and she wouldn't be doing it alone. The frontier wasn't built by perfect heroes. It was carved out by broken people who refused to shatter completely. Harlan and Hattie's story proves that sometimes salvation doesn't look like a rescue. It looks like a shared burden in the middle of a brutal winter. If you felt the raw grit of this Wild West survival story, hit that like button, share it with someone who appreciates grounded, emotional storytelling, and subscribe for more gripping tales from the untamed frontier.